Welcome in, everybody, to a deep dive that's less about textbooks and more about, like, treasure maps, the kind that lead to the hidden vaults kind of controlling our schools.
I like that.
We're going deep on something that hits close to home for all of us, the influence of private money, specifically dark money, on public education.
Right.
And before you think, oh, this doesn't affect me, think again. This impacts your local communities, how your tax dollars are spent, and potentially even the quality of education your kids receive.
It's a big deal.
Get ready to uncover some surprising players. We're talking billionaires with an agenda and right-wing think tanks working behind the scenes. These aren't just wealthy folks writing checks. They're strategically trying to shape the future of education to fit their vision.
Yeah, their vision and nobody else's.
Intrigued?
Good.
Because we've got a stack of sources that read like a detective novel, ready to expose what's really going on.
Lay it on me.
First up, we've got an interview from WDET Public Radio featuring Maurice Cunningham, an education researcher who's been tracking this dark money trail for years.
Oh, yeah, he's been on this for a while. Good stuff.
We'll also be digging into an infographic from the Culturally Responsive Education Hub, which pulls no punches in naming names and revealing connections.
Yeah, don't mess around.
And to understand how this impacts rural communities, we'll turn to an investigative report from the news organization, Barnraiser. They've been on the front lines documenting the real-world consequences of these tactics.
Important voices to hear from, for sure.
Our mission today, to unmask how private money is being used to influence public education, and more importantly, what it means for everyday citizens like you. So, let's set the stage, shall we? The core issue here is that a network of wealthy individuals and organizations are actively working to undermine and defund public schools.
Working to dismantle it, really.
And it's not some conspiracy theory. We've got it right here in black and white. Rupert Murdoch. Yes, that Rupert Murdoch is quoted in one of our sources describing education as a $500 billion market. Not as a public good, but a market. What does that tell you about his motivations?
Well, I mean, it's pretty clear, right? He sees dollar signs. That's what...
Suggests he sees a profit to be made, which raises concerns about whether his efforts to influence education are driven by a genuine desire to improve it or by something else entirely.
Follow the money, right?
Yeah. And he's not alone. Betsy DeVos, the former Secretary of Education, makes her goals very clear. She's been quoted saying she wants to use education to advance God's kingdom.
We saw how that went.
Now, while her personal beliefs are her own, this raises some red flags. Should public schools, funded by taxpayers of all faiths and those with no faith at all, be used to advance a particular religious agenda? It's a valid question, wouldn't you say?
It's a huge question. And it gets at a real tension point in our society today. The separation of church and state, especially when it comes to education. I mean, you start mixing those things and it gets complicated really fast. And, DeVos with her whole push for school choice and vouchers. Well, critics say that just funnels public money away from public schools and often towards religious schools. So you can see why people are worried.
Absolutely. It points to a broader concern about the separation of church and state when it comes to education. And when you consider that DeVos is a staunch advocate for school choice and voucher programs, which critics argue divert public funds towards private, often religious institutions, it becomes clear why people are worried.
Exactly.
So we've got these powerful figures with their sights set on reshaping education, but how do they actually go about it? What are their tactics?
Well, one thing that pops up again and again in these sources is this whole scholarship and tax credit thing.
Okay, on the surface, who doesn't love a good scholarship? It sounds like a win-win.
Right. Sure, that's the idea. They make it sound like everyone benefits, but what Cunningham points out is that these scholarships and tax credits are often, well, they're kind of sneakily used to siphon money away from public schools.
So instead of those tax dollars going towards resources that benefit all students, they're being redirected to private institutions, often benefiting a select few.
Exactly, and that's just one part of it. This brings us to a whole other level of this strategy, which is basically making people distrust public schools. The Barnraiser article really gets into this, and it's kind of scary, to be honest.
So it's not enough to just advocate for alternatives. They have to actively make public schools look bad.
Pretty much. It's like they're trying to convince everyone that public schools are so broken that privatization is the only answer. And to make this whole thing seem like a ground-up movement, they create these astroturf movements.
AstroTurf, what's that?
Basically, it's like a fake grassroots movement. It looks like concerned parents are rising up, but behind the scenes, it's all orchestrated and bankrolled by these wealthy donors.
So it's all a facade.
You got it. And they're really good at it, too. The Barnraiser article even has this 4-part test to help you spot these astroturf campaigns.
Like a BS detector.
Exactly. Like, how fast is this group growing? Who's funding them? Do they actually represent the community they claim to be fighting for? It's all about looking behind the curtain.
So how do we even know who's pulling the strings?
Well, that's where that infographic from the Culturally Responsive Education Hub comes in handy. They do a great job of connecting the dots, naming groups like Moms for Liberty, Parents Defending Education, the Heritage Foundation. These groups, they've become really loud in the education debate lately.
And those are the AstroTurf groups.
Often, yeah. They're often the face of these movements, but behind them you'll find some big names, and I mean big money.
Like who? Give us names.
Where? Okay, so we're talking about people like Charles Koch, the DeVos family, the Walton family, yes, the Walmart Waltons. These aren't just your average donors. These are people with the resources to seriously influence policy and shape how the public thinks.
So it's not just about pushing a particular ideology.
Oh, it's definitely about that too, but it goes deeper. It's about power, controlling where the money flows, what gets taught in schools, basically molding the future of education to fit their worldview.
And their worldview is.
Well, based on what we're seeing, it's all about privatization, often with a healthy dose of specific religious views, which raises concerns about what happens to the students and families who don't fit into that box, you know?
Right, right. And speaking of not fitting in, we haven't even touched on the impact of all this on rural communities.
And that's where it gets even more worrying, honestly. The Barn Raiser article doesn't sugarcoat it. These tactics hit rural schools the hardest. These are schools that are often the heart of their communities, already struggling with limited resources, and this just makes everything worse.
It's like they're pulling the rug out from under these towns that rely so heavily on their public schools.
That's exactly what it is. And the worst part is the way they do it often turns neighbor against neighbor, creating all this division and distrust where there should be unity.
It's like a textbook divide and conquer strategy.
Right. The Barn Raiser article even quotes the president of the Ohio Federation of Teachers saying that this whole approach goes against like the whole idea of rural communities helping each other out. And I think that really sums it up, you know?
It's about weaponizing people's fears, their very real concerns about their kids' education, to push an agenda that most people wouldn't support if they knew what was really going on.
100%. And let's not forget the financial burden this all puts on states that buy into these voucher programs. I mean, Arizona's looking at a $1.4 billion budget shortfall because of their voucher program. Ohio's not doing much better with a $966.2 million deficit, and guess why? Vouchers.
That's money that could be going towards, actually supporting public schools, helping all students, but instead it's being siphoned off, leaving these communities to deal with the fallout.
And that's the real tragedy of it all.
But it's not all doom and gloom, right? There are signs that people are fighting back, that they're starting to see through all of this.
Exactly. Remember those school board elections, the ones where all those Moms for Liberty candidates got defeated? I mean, that's got to tell you something.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
People are starting to catch on.
Yeah.
They're realizing that this whole dismantle public education thing isn't actually good for anyone,
Wow.
except maybe the folks who stand to profit from it.
Right. It's like they're realizing that defunding public schools doesn't magically make private schools better. It just makes education worse for everyone.
Right, and it's not just about voting in these local elections either.
Yeah.
There are groups out there, organizations like Red, Wine, and Blue, Educated We Stand, Defensive Democracy. They're all actively fighting back against these attacks on public education.
What are they doing? Like protesting at school board meetings. Some of that, sure. But they're also organizing parents, educators, regular people. They're getting them to speak out, to get involved, to hold these groups accountable.
So it's about more than just showing up at a meeting and yelling at the school board.
Way more. It's about understanding the issues, knowing who to trust, and making your voice heard. These groups, they get it. They know that knowledge is power, and they're doing the work to expose what's really going on.
It's kind of inspiring, isn't it, to see people coming together like that, to protect something as fundamental as public education.
It really is. Because at the end of the day, education shouldn't be about some ideological battleground or a way to make a quick buck. It's about giving every single child the chance to succeed, regardless of their background or zip code.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Yeah.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the one thing you want our listeners to take away from all of this? Especially those who are ready to stand up for their local schools.
Well, the Culturally Responsive Education Hub, they have this great call to action, and it boils down to this: be informed and be engaged. That means showing up at school board meetings, not to shout people down or ban books,
Right.
but to really listen, to ask questions, and to make your voice heard. Don't be afraid to ask those tough questions. Who's funding these groups that are suddenly so interested in your school board? What's their agenda? And most importantly, does it align with what's best for all students, not just a select few?
Follow the money, right?
Exactly. And
Hmm.
don't just keep it to yourself. Talk to your friends, your family, your neighbors. Have those conversations because the more people who understand what's happening, the better equipped we'll be to fight back.
Knowledge is power, like you said.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what this whole deep dive has been about.
Hmm.
We wanted to give you the information, the context, and hopefully a little bit of fire in your belly to stay curious, to keep asking those hard questions, and to fight for the kind of education system we all deserve.
Well said.
We've unpacked a lot today. The tactics being used, the people and the money behind it all, and the very real consequences of letting private interests call the shots on public education. But as we've seen, it's not a done deal. People are waking up, they're pushing back, and they're fighting for the soul of public education. And that's where you come in, dear listeners. We've given you the tools. Now it's your turn to dig deeper, stay engaged, and make your voice heard. The future of education might just depend on it. And on that note, until next time, keep asking those tough questions and never underestimate your power to make a difference.